Before we dive in, let me quickly remind you, hit that subscribe button. Right now, only 0.7% of my viewers are actually subscribed. Once we hit 1,000 subscribers, I'll drop an exclusive special video just for you. Now, let's get into it. Sheriff Jake Carter was finally getting a rare, peaceful weekend. His house sat right at the edge of the neighborhood, just beyond the HOA's control, exactly how he liked it. With his steaming cup of coffee in hand, he was about to settle in when, screch. The sound of tires skidding outside shattered the morning calm. Seconds later, his neighbor, Tom, came storming up his porch, face red with fury. "They've lost their damn minds, Jake." Tom panted, furiously pointing down the road. Jake frowned. "Come again." Tom threw his hands up, barely containing his anger. "Spike strips. The HOA put down spike strips on our road. They say it's to stop reckless driving." That made no sense. The road leading to their homes wasn't private. It was county-maintained. The HOA had no authority over it. Clearly, something was wrong. Jake sighed. "I'll take a look." He grabbed his keys and hopped in his truck. As he neared the neighborhood entrance, he spotted them instantly, gleaming metal spikes embedded in the pavement, controlled by some sort of remote mechanism. And standing proudly beside them, a man in an HOA security uniform, arms crossed like he owned the place. Jake rolled down his window. "Morning. What's this about?" The guard, a smug-looking guy named Greg, flashed a smirk. "New HOA safety measure. Keeps non-members from speeding through." Jake's grip on the wheel tightened. "This is a county road, not HOA property." Greg simply shrugged. "Our board says otherwise. Got a problem? Take it up with them." Before Jake could respond, a sedan turned into the neighborhood. The driver, completely unaware of the trap, drove straight over the spikes. Pop. A loud, sharp noise cut through the air, followed by a startled yell. The car wobbled to a stop, both front tires completely shredded. Jake exhaled slowly. This wasn't just an overstep. This was a lawsuit waiting to happen. And the HOA? They had no idea who they were messing with. The driver, a middle-aged man in a button-down shirt, stepped out, staring in disbelief at his ruined tires. "You've got to be kidding me," he shouted, pointing furiously at the spikes. "What the hell is this?" Greg, the self-appointed HOA enforcer, barely even looked at him. "You should have read the new HOA rules. All non-approved vehicles must stop for inspection." The man's face darkened. "Inspection? I live here." Greg pulled out a clipboard, looking more like a border agent than a security guard. "Then you should have registered your vehicle with the HOA. No sticker, no entry." Jake leaned against his truck, arms folded, watching the ridiculous exchange unfold. Greg was clearly enjoying his tiny bit of power, while the poor driver was about 1 second away from losing it. Enough was enough. Jake straightened. "You do realize disabling vehicles like this is illegal, right?" Greg smirked. "It's not illegal. The HOA board approved it." Jake sighed. "You think the HOA board gets to override county law?" Greg crossed his arms. "Unless you're an HOA member, your opinion doesn't matter." Jake held back a laugh. If only Greg knew who he was talking to. Instead, he changed tactics. "How do you control these?" Greg tapped his pocket. "Remote access. Only HOA security can disable them. Keeps the riffraff out." The man with the blown tires stepped closer, voice shaking with frustration. "You just cost me $2,000 in damage." Greg didn't even flinch. "You can file a complaint with the board." Jake had seen enough. This wasn't just overstepping boundaries. This was a full-blown power trip. Jake smiled slightly. "All right. I'll take it up with the board." Greg gave him a mocking nod. "Smart choice." Jake chuckled. "Yeah, real smart." Little did they know they had just pissed off the actual sheriff. Jake wasn't just annoyed. Now, he was curious. HOA overreach was nothing new, but spike strips? That was next level. He crouched down, studying the mechanism. These weren't cheap pop-up spikes. They were motorized. They only retracted when Greg pressed his remote. That meant they could trap anyone at will. A voice cut through his thoughts. "Sheriff Carter, isn't it?" Jake looked up. Nancy Wilkins, HOA president. She approached with her usual forced smile, the kind of slick confidence only someone used to getting their way could have. "You must understand," she said, clasping her hands together. "This is about safety. We had an incident last month. Someone drove 10 miles over the limit. We can't have chaos." Jake raised an eyebrow. "And this safety measure only applies to people without HOA stickers?" Nancy's smile never wavered. "We have to control access. HOA members follow the rules. Outsiders not so much." Jake glanced over at the trapped driver, still fuming over his ruined tires. "So, if I don't pay HOA dues, I'm an outsider? Even though I live right next door?" Nancy tilted her head slightly. "Technically, yes." Jake laughed.
"Right.
"Well, I'll be looking into this." As he walked away, something caught his eye. A small camera mounted high up on a street lamp. If the HOA was recording, then they had proof of every illegal stop. That could be very useful. But Jake didn't tell them what he was planning. Let them think they'd won.
For now."
Back at his office, he leaned back in his chair, tapping his fingers on the desk. His gut told him this wasn't just an overreach. This was a profit scheme, and he was about to blow it wide open. The sheriff who took down an HOA power trip. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe. Only 0.7% of you are actually subscribed, and when we hit 1,000 subscribers, I'll drop an exclusive special video just for you. Now, let's get into it. Sheriff Jake Carter had a hunch. After Greg's little stunt with the spike strips, Jake went straight to the county's property records. And just as he suspected, the road wasn't HOA-controlled. It was county-maintained, meaning Greg and his wannabe enforcers had absolutely no legal authority to block it, let alone damage vehicles. But Jake didn't stop there. He dug deeper, searching for complaints against the HOA. And what he found? Worse than he ever imagined. Dozens of residents had filed reports. Excessive fines. Threats of foreclosure over something as small as non-compliant lawn furniture. Even legally parked cars being towed without warning. The spike strips? Just the latest in a long pattern of HOA extortion. Bingo! Jake grabbed his phone. First call, Doug at the county commissioner's office. "Hey Doug, I need confirmation. Maple Ridge Road is public property, right?" Doug chuckled. "You mean the road the HOA's been trying to claim for years?"
"Yeah."
"It's not theirs." "Why?" Jake grinned. "Because they just set up spike strips and are charging access fees." Doug let out a low whistle. "That's felony territory." Next call, his deputies. "Meet me at Maple Ridge tomorrow morning. We're shutting this down." Jake hung up, satisfied. But something nagged at him. The HOA had to know they didn't own that road. So, why were they pushing their luck? That meant one of two things. They thought they could get away with it. They had bigger plans. Either way, they were about to find out just how wrong they were. Catching them red-handed. Jake wasn't going to just tell the HOA they were breaking the law. He was going to prove it, beyond a shadow of a doubt. That night, he parked his truck a few blocks away and walked back to the spike strips. Small hidden camera in hand. He'd seen the setup during the day, but now, under the cover of darkness, he wanted to see who was really running this scam. Carefully, he placed the camera high on a street lamp, angled perfectly toward the spikes. Then he waited. Sure enough, just past midnight, a golf cart rolled up, its tiny headlights flickering against the pavement.
"Greg."
Jake watched as the HOA enforcer hopped out, glancing around like he was in some high-stakes spy movie. Then, click. Greg pressed a button on his remote. The spikes retracted, but instead of leaving them down, he reset them manually, making sure unsuspecting drivers would be trapped again by morning. And Greg wasn't done. He pulled out a clipboard, flipping through a list of license plates. Jake's eyes narrowed. They were targeting specific people. HOA members? Spikes down. Non-members? Spikes up. Greg chuckled to himself before climbing back into his golf cart and disappearing into the night. Jake smirked. Gotcha. The HOA's worst nightmare. By morning, Jake had everything he needed. White heavy checkmark proof of intent. White heavy checkmark proof of selective targeting. White heavy checkmark proof that this wasn't about safety. It was about money. It was about control. And when the HOA woke up, the law would be waiting for them. HOA's reckoning. Jake rolled up to Maple Ridge Road. But this time, he wasn't alone. Oncoming police car, oncoming police car, oncoming police car. 3 squad cars followed behind, red and blue lights flashing. Deputies stepped out, hands resting on their belts. Greg, still half asleep in his golf cart, nearly choked on his coffee. What's going on?" he stammered. Jake stepped forward, holding up his badge. "Sheriff Jake Carter. You're under investigation for illegal road obstruction, willful property damage, and extortion." Nancy Wilkins, the HOA president, came running out of her house, already in a panic. "This is a misunderstanding. We were just enforcing neighborhood rules." Jake pulled out his tablet. Hit play. The hidden camera footage lit up the screen. Greg sneaking out at night, resetting the spike strips, checking a list of approved vehicles. Nancy's face drained of color. Jake folded his arms. "You knew this road wasn't yours." Greg opened his mouth to argue, but a deputy was already slapping handcuffs on him. The HOA board members? Frozen, watching their so-called enforcers get hauled away. Jake turned to Nancy. "Still want to talk about misunderstandings?" She didn't say a word. Smart choice. The HOA collapses. By noon, news vans had lined up along the street. Reporters shoved microphones in residents' faces. The footage of Greg rigging the spike strips? Going viral. "Small blue diamond, this is insane." One resident fumed. "I pay thousands in HOA fees, and this is how they spend it? Installing traps." "Small blue diamond, I got fined last year for non-compliant flower pots." A woman shook her head. "Now I find out they were illegally damaging cars. I want my money back." Nancy tried to hold her ground, but it was over. Jake stepped in. Greg's already facing felony charges. And since this was a planned scheme, the entire HOA board is now under investigation for fraud and mismanagement. The crowd gasped. Nancy let out a weak laugh. "You can't do that." Jake smirked. "I can. And I am." The aftermath. That evening, the HOA meeting was a war zone. Homeowners were furious. "You blew through our budget on illegal spike strips," one man yelled. "What else have you been hiding?" another snapped. Nancy, sweating bullets, tried to regain control. "If you all just calm down." "Shut it, Nancy," an old man in the back bellowed. The vote was unanimous. The HOA board was dissolved. And just like that, Nancy's empire crumbled. A new beginning. With the HOA dead and buried, the neighborhood finally felt normal again. White heavy checkmark, no more random fines. White heavy checkmark, no more ridiculous rules. White heavy checkmark, no more power-hungry enforcers lurking around like wannabe cops. To celebrate, the residents threw a massive barbecue. The first real community event that wasn't an HOA-controlled nightmare. And as Jake sat back, sipping his drink, he had just one thought. That's how you take down an HOA.